Stay groovy. Comment, like, share, subscribe.
Rankin Bass are fondly remembered for their enchanting stop-motion holiday specials and classic 80s animations such as The Last Unicorn and Thundercats. But their pioneering efforts to adapt the works of J.R.R. Tolkien have been both heavily criticized and neglected in the history of animation. There is very little information about how these two classics were produced. I have always loved and appreciated these two films. Instead of rehashing the obvious flaws of 1977's The Hobbit as a Tolkien adaptation, this mini-documentary outlines the inception and making of the film, highlighting the struggle and ultimate success of the production. This is The Making of Rankin Bass's The Hobbit, 1977.
Initiate sequence. Retrotron Entertainment presents
The Making of The Hobbit. Founded in 1960 by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass in New York City, Rankin Bass Productions, initially known as Videocraft International, was primed to make a significant impact in the world of animation. The studio's unique visual style was characterized by doll-like characters with spheroid body parts, crafted through a stop-motion technique dubbed animagic, which became their trademark. The snowy, textured landscapes of their winter specials became iconic, capturing the imaginations of viewers across generations. The majority of Rankin and Bass's stop-motion work was created overseas, predominantly in Tokyo, Japan. This decision was a pragmatic one, providing the studio with cost-effective means to produce their animated content. They were pioneers in the field, being among the first Western studios to outsource animation production to foreign studios, a practice that is commonplace in the industry today. The animagic productions of the 1960s were chiefly helmed by Japanese stop-motion animator Tadahito Mokenaga at his studio MOM Production. Mokenaga's guidance and expertise were critical in shaping the visual appeal that would become synonymous with the Rankin Bass brand. The key to the classic animagic style was born out of budgetary constraints. Instead of animating at 24 frames per second, Rankin Bass animated at 12 frames per second. This is what gives their classic holiday specials the look of toys being manipulated by a child, and probably why, to this day, children are enraptured by these films. Beyond stop motion, the Rankin Bass traditional animation was developed by a variety of Japanese animation studios, with Top Craft playing a pivotal role. Toru Hara, an alumnus of Toei Animation, founded Top Craft in 1972 and would eventually become a significant partner in Rankin Bass's animation ventures. Topcraft emerged as an essential collaborator with Rankin Bass, bringing their animated visions to life. The studio was not only integral in the production of Rankin Bass specials, but also served as a crucible for animation talent. Industry legends like Hayao Miyazaki would later build their own studios on the Topcraft talent pool, which speaks volumes about the level of artistry the studio nurtured. The eventual dissolution of Topcraft in 1985 and the birth of Studio Ghibli from its ashes underscored the creative prowess that had been developed under its roof. Before its closure, Topcraft made significant contributions to Rankin Bass, animating a variety of projects, including those featuring pop cultural icons like the Jackson 5 and the Osmonds. Yet, it was The Hobbit that stood as one of the notable high points in this collaboration in the 1970s. Rankin Bass also distinguished themselves with their use of name talent for narration and voice acting. The studio had its own company of voice actors, initially based in Toronto and supervised by veteran CBC announcer Bernard Cohen. This group brought to life the various fantastical characters with an ear for distinctive and engaging performances. Complementing the visuals and voice acting was the music, under the direction of Maury Laws, who lent his talents to almost all Rankin Bass films and television programs. Romeo Mueller, a frequent collaborator, provided the screenwriting for many of their best-loved productions. The Rankin Bass adaptation of The Hobbit stood out as a unique endeavor outside their usual scope of holiday specials and pop culture-driven projects. The studio had to draw upon its deep well of creative resources and the international partnerships it had cultivated over the years, particularly its alliance with Topcraft. The 1977 animated telefilm was poised to transport audiences to Middle-earth, encapsulating the adventurous spirit of Tolkien's literary masterpiece through the distinctive Rankin Bass lens. The journey began in 1972 and would take 5 years to complete. As the conceptual phase for the Hobbit animated adaptation took shape, Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass faced a labyrinth of copyright considerations that would have baffled many a seasoned producer. The world they sought to animate was deeply entrenched in the legal skirmishes of copyright law, which would inadvertently affect the production timeline and the scope of the adaptation itself. When Arthur Rankin Jr. stepped into the role of both producer and production designer for the Hobbit telefilm, his reverence for Tolkien's work was clear. In his interactions with the press, Rankin committed to a faithful adaptation, expressing a desire to introduce nothing into the animated narrative that Tolkien hadn't envisioned. With a $3 million budget, as reported by the New York Times, the project was initially ambitiously structured as a 2-part miniseries. Part 1 adapting The Hobbit, and Part 2 adapting The Return of the King. However, as is often the case with such adaptations, the complexity of bringing Tolkien's rich tapestry to life delayed the second part's production by several years. In the thick of these creative processes, a contention over copyright arose. Rankin, in a 2003 interview, mentioned that at the time of the film's creation, The Hobbit was considered to be in public domain, a statement that contradicted the position of the Tolkien estate, which believed they held the film rights. During the period of the Lord of the Rings publications, there was an erroneous belief, infamously made by Ace Books, that the American editions were not under copyright protection, prompting an unauthorized edition of Lord of the Rings. It took vigorous protest by Tolkien and his publishers, along with the threat of lost royalties, to give fans of Middle-earth the first authorized paperback edition from Ballantine Books. While the legal debates simmered in the background, the Rankin Bass team focused on the pre-production of The Hobbit. The interlude afforded by the legal ambiguity was spent creating elaborate concept art, detailed storyboards, and intricate character designs, which would become the foundation of their animated world. This pre-production phase was vital in setting the visual tone and ensuring that the adaptation would visually resonate with Tolkien's descriptive prose. The result of this tumultuous preliminary phase would be an animated classic that has captivated audiences for decades, despite the initial copyright confusion that clouded its inception. Once the copyright issues were worked out, although some parties contend they never were, pre-production could proceed. After seeing several illustrations drawn by Lester Abrams for the magazine Children's Digest, illustrating scenes from The Hobbit, Arthur Rankin extended an invitation to come and work on their production. After submitting 20 character designs, Lester Abrams heard no more from Rankin Bass for 2 years. Probably around 1975, he finally received word from the studio and was called in to take over character design for both The Hobbit and The Return of the King, along with Arthur Rankin. Lester recalled his participation in the production in 2002. Disney was everything to me when I was growing up, Abrams said, and in college I had fallen in love with illustrator Arthur Rackham. I used a lot of Rackham illustrations to find the faces for the dwarves. In doing them and adapting them for animation, I realized I was treading on the same track as the Disney animators. I found the sources for Grumpy, which I used for Thorin. When I was in my junior year at Rhode Island School of Design, we had to do a series of pen and inks. My favorite book had been The Hobbit, so I did Bilbo sitting in front of the Hobbit hole. I hadn't done pen and ink before, and I had no idea that I was ever going to do anything with those. In the end, that's the face they used. They put big eyes on it because the Japanese artists always put big eyes on their main characters. A self-portrait by Leonardo da Vinci was the basis for Gandalf, and the voice was provided by director John Huston. Huston was very enthusiastic about getting this role. He was familiar with Gandalf. Arthur Rankin tried to direct him, and he said, No, that's not how it goes. He directed himself in the role. Arthur Rankin was delighted that he had this major director directing himself. Gollum came partially from my love of Disney. I liked to draw Donald Duck as a kid. When I did the 2 orbs for eyes for Gollum, I dramatically put the wide, thin mouth in because I had drawn Donald Duck so many times. My initial Gollum was a more benign representation. I saw the character more as a degenerate hobbit than as a cannibal. At Arthur Rankin's urging, Gollum was made more ferocious and threatening. The goblins and the trolls were all big lugs. I didn't know how I was going to distinguish them. When I did the goblins, I went to an anatomy that was far away from human, so they could look distinct from the other characters. I used frog anatomy there. As a joke, I put Roman centurion costumes on the goblin guards. I thought, we can't have frogs in Roman centurion costumes, but it worked. For the trolls, we went with John Bauer, a famous Swedish illustrator. I basically worked from his trolls, and years later they were used for the Dark Crystal. I intended for them to stay hunched over the way they do in the Dark Crystal, but the animators lifted them up and they walked upright like big lugs. I was sort of disappointed with that. I did the Elf King on the bus in New York when I was taking some of the work to the studio. There was something familiar about the image of Thranduil, the Elf King, and I didn't know what it was. Years later I realized that it was Yul Brynner from the 10 Commandments. Yul Brynner was seated on the throne with his legs spread out and bare-legged. I was disappointed with Elrond. I thought he resembled Emperor Ming from Flash Gordon. Although Romeo Mueller wrote the script, I had some influence on it. Arthur Rankin wanted to eliminate the spiders. He said they didn't advance the story. But I said they are the most distinct visually because of their shapes. In the end, it became a choice between the spiders and Bjorn. Bjorn was never even designed. Once the 2 films were scripted and designed, the voice actors were cast. The voice cast for the animated adaptation of The Hobbit is notably varied and filled with distinguished actors from the mid-20th century, each bringing a wealth of experience to their roles. Orson Bean lent his distinctive voice to Bilbo Baggins, infusing the character with a fussy and proper personality that evolved over the course of the story. Richard Boone took on the menacing voice of Smaug, bringing his Western film gravitas to the dragon's smoldering menace. Boone's filmography, filled with over 50 films, predominantly Westerns, allowed him to portray Smaug with a commanding presence. Hans Conried provided the voice for Thorin Oakenshield, leader of the dwarves. Conrad's extensive background in both comedic and serious roles contributed to his portrayal of the dwarf seeking to reclaim his homeland. John Huston, an acclaimed film director and actor, voiced Gandalf as well as served as the narrator. His vast experience in filmmaking and storytelling added a depth and gravitas to the wise wizard and the story's narration. Otto Preminger voiced the Elven King, bringing his experience as a director and actor known for pushing the boundaries of film content to the regal character. Cyril Richard played Elrond, bringing a theatrical flair to the Elven Lord. Brother Theodore's voice work as Gollum tapped into his unique brand of stand-up tragedy, channeling a darkly comic and eccentric style into the twisted creature obsessed with the One Ring. Paul Frees, my favorite of all the Rankin Bass repertory actors, contributed multiple character voices, including Bombur and one of the trolls, showcasing his versatility and weird, tremulous voice. Known as the Man of 1,000 Voices, Frees was adept at creating a wide array of distinct characters. Jack DeLeon voiced multiple dwarf characters, utilizing his acting skills honed in television, where he played many roles. Don Messick's voice talents were applied to characters like Balin and the Great Goblin, drawing on his extensive experience with voice work in Hanna-Barbera cartoons. Thurl Ravenscroft lent his deep voice to the goblin choruses and other background voices. His voice was synonymous with Tony the Tiger and "You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch," indicating his capacity to create memorable vocal performances. The casting for The Hobbit reflected the production's commitment to quality and depth, with each actor bringing something unique to the table. This range of talent helped to create a rich oral tapestry that brought Tolkien's world to life for viewers. With everything in order, animation production commenced in Tokyo, Japan. Arthur Rankin said in 1977. 5 years ago, when I decided that the first Tolkien property that I could handle was The Hobbit, it was because of the main character himself. The Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, has attitudes and characteristics described by Tolkien that are animatable. When you see him struggling to keep up with the others on his adventure, you feel sympathy for him. The title of the picture is The Hobbit. Our star is The Hobbit, and The Hobbit is what the picture is about. He's a catalyst to all the bizarre things happening to him. Without that sympathetic character as a thread, you can't get away with doing a picture about goblins and dwarves. Maybe the new fantasy market, the popularity of movies like Star Wars, has come from Tolkien. The old wizard with the Force in Star Wars. That's Gandalf, the wizard of The Hobbit. The young fellow having adventures, good versus evil. That's the White Tower versus the Black Tower in The Lord of the Rings. Concerning the now uncertain fate of the sequel film, Rankin said, "If The Hobbit is a success on television, we will release it to the theaters. Then we will go on to complete our next Tolkien work, which will continue the characters we have established in The Hobbit, and will be adapted from The Return of the King, the last book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. At this point, we are scripted for that. The music is composed and recorded, our backgrounds are painted, the soundtrack is partially completed, and new characters are designed, such as Frodo Baggins." Regarding the voice cast, Rankin had this to say in 1977. "Orson Bean has a demeanor and a voice quality and a private style of life that is very much like a Hobbit. I love to hear Richard Boone snarl and fume and wreak vengeance. And Richard says he loves to play bad guys because there's more dimension to the villain. But he didn't know Tolkien, and Richard's son is a Tolkien aficionado. Dad, are you sure you can handle this?" he said. "Please don't louse it up." I kept saying, "Dick, you're not broad enough." Finally, he burst into flame. He knocked over the script stand and spilled coffee all over Orson Bean. We had our dragon. I borrowed from a lot of sources, but the Rackham influence is heavy. I couldn't think of anyone better in the history of illustration to visualize Tolkien than Rackham. But the color sense is Tolkien's and mine. I like monochromatic works, and I saw the whole picture in a series of monochromatic designs. There are about a dozen major sequences, and each has its key color. The Hobbit hole is springtime greens, Gollum's cave, purples, the Goblin's place, red, Smaug's cave, golden. But wherever Tolkien said that anything was a certain color, we have to use that color. On the screen, Gandalf has a tall pointed blue hat and a long gray cloak, a silver scarf, a white beard, and immense black boots, just as he has here on page 17 of the paperback edition of The Hobbit. Orson Bean stated at the time, "Like Bilbo, I'm approaching 50, and I have a basically comfortable life, filled with spoons and jams. And still, I get into adventures. For the past 7 years, I've been living an adventure. My wife and I sold our house in New York and moved to Australia for a year. Then we came back and spent almost 3 years bumming around the country in an old 61 VW van. We put the kids in school, wherever we happened to be, but mainly we reveled in being rootless. I didn't use a voice change to do Bilbo. I have a distinctive voice anyway. I did an attitude change, making Bilbo kind of fussy and proper, then gradually dropped the fussiness and properness as the madness of battle really affected him." Animator Toru Hara, alongside Sugoyuki Kubo, Hidetoshi Kaneko, Kazuko Ito, and Minoru Nishida, were all instrumental in animating the mythical landscapes and characters. Their work not only brought The Hobbit to life, but also set the stage for The Return of the King, ensuring a continuity in the realm they so vividly animated. In retrospect, Arthur Rankin later said, "It was a big challenge to make that material from that book and turn it into an animatable script and an animatable production." The Hobbit was indeed a rating success in 1977. Precise figures are not available, but the success of the telefilm gave Rankin Bass the green light to complete work on The Return of the King, which was released in 1980. In 1978, Romeo Mueller won a Peabody Award for his teleplay for The Hobbit. The film was also nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, but lost to Star Wars. A few days before its first airing, John J. O'Connor wrote in The New York Times that Rankin and Bass Productions have now carefully translated The Hobbit into film. The result is curiously eclectic, but filled with nicely effective moments. The drawings frequently suggest strong resemblances to non-Tolkien characters. The goblins could have stepped out of a Maurice Sendak book, but the dragon and Gollum the riddle aficionado bring some clever original touches. Whatever its flaws, this television version of The Hobbit warrants attention. Most of The Hobbit's criticism has stemmed from its worth as an adaptation of a literary classic, including the unfamiliar style of artwork used by the Japanese-American co-production team, whereas some Tolkien fans question the appropriateness of repackaging the book as a family film for a very young audience. The true success of the 1977 Rankin Bass production of The Hobbit was the joy it brought to children around the world. This modest film created a whole new generation of Tolkien readers and introduced audiences that would not normally have been interested to the world of Middle-earth. Picking out the flaws in the Rankin Bass Tolkien adaptations is easy, and YouTube is filled with smug videos mocking and denigrating these films. But you have to wonder, if they are so bad, why do generations of viewers love them so much? I think the answer is simple. They are labors of love. Love for animation. Love for making an audience happy. Love for Tolkien. These films were not made to please critics, make money by cashing in on a trend, or to score virtue signaling points with the thought police. They were made out of love, and while they may not be perfect, decade after decade, they receive that love in return from an appreciative audience, while so many other films are forgotten. Be sure to hit the bell for notifications so you never miss out on new videos and community posts.